This is part 44, and we will continue our discussion with the group of the sections where there is absence of criminal intention. And then the first section with which we dealt is section 81 of the Indian Penal Code, where we learn if the act is done which is likely to cause harm, but if that is done in order to avoid more harm, and you have a knowledge, no doubt about it, but with that is in the absence of criminal intention and the person has acted in good faith, he is protected as per section 81 of the Indian Penal Code is concerned. And then when we started discussing section 81, what is the liability if nine persons kill one person and then they eat his flesh, and then their defense is that by killing one person it was possible for us to save nine lives. What is their liability? And then I just refer to one point, and that is, what do you mean by necessity as a defense? That is not the doctrine which is mentioned anywhere in the Indian Penal Code. But when you read section 81, that is doctrine as far as English law is concerned. But if you read section 81 and then read section 81 with that of section 94, for example, by the second illustration, if A puts Mr. B in fear of instant death and tells him that kill Mr. C, otherwise I will kill you, B kills Mr. C, what is liability of Mr. B is the question for our consideration. Can he say, well, if I would not have killed, that would have resulted into my death, and it was because of the necessity that I killed? As in a case of an illustration where you can't kill somebody in order to save your life. So those nine persons who killed one person are not, they had criminal intention, and then hence we say they are not at all protected as far as section 81 of the Indian Penal Code is concerned. And now to understand section 94, which deals with what do you mean by compulsion or threat as a defense, or if you read the heading of the section, it says act to which a person is compelled by threats. We try to understand importance as far as this exception is concerned, section 94 of the Indian Penal Code. Now the only exception, if by this time we have dealt with many exceptions and we will continue, every section starts with the wording nothing is an offense which is done. But then this is the only exception which doesn't start with nothing is an offense, it starts with exception, with which that is one point. But then in order to understand section 94, whether compulsion or threat can be a defense, we shall start dealing with four different illustrations, and if it is possible for you to find out answer to these illustrations, then you can master section 94 within few seconds. The first illustration: A puts Mr. B in fear of instant death and tells him, kill Mr. C, otherwise I will kill you. B kills Mr. C. What is B's liability? Second situation: Mr. A has a revolver and he puts Mr. B in fear of instant death and tells him, by giving him one stick, says, give one blow to Mr. C, otherwise I will kill you. And Mr. B has given blow to Mr. C and has committed the offense of voluntarily causing, technically as defined by section 321. What is liability of Mr. B? The third situation: Mr. A is having a stick and he tells Mr. B, I will beat you, I will give you blow with the help of the stick unless you give one blow to Mr. C. And then Mr. B gives one blow to Mr. C. What is B's liability is the question for our consideration. And the last situation is last illustration, in which case it so happens that Mr. A tells Mr. B that you commit theft with respect to pain of Mr. C within a period of 8 days, and then if I don't get that pain before expiration of the period of 8 days, I will kill you. He has not done anything, But after 7 days, he has the he immediately goes to the place of Mr. C and commits theft. And now, what is liability of Mr. C is the question for our consideration. Now, in all the situations with which you are dealt so far, you will understand one thing. When Mr. B is taken before the court of law, the defense that is raised by Mr. B at the time of the trial is that, well, I have not done this of my own. I was compelled to do it because of the threats. And then when you do an act which is done by you against by you because of the threats, it cannot be said that you have done an act yourself. It is done against your will, or I mean, there it cannot. In other words, it can be said that there was the absence of criminal intention. And when the act is done in the absence of criminal intention, that is not made punishable, because when we dealt with the understanding as far as the offense is concerned, we all learned offense is equal to mens rea plus actus reus. Mere act is not punishable, mere intention is not made punishable. Act done with a particular criminal intention only is made punishable by the provisions of the Indian Penal Code. Hence, what is liability of Mr. B in all these illustrations is the question for our consideration. And then, in order to understand this, in order to understand this, as we have dealt with, we have learned that what is liability of Mr. C as far as various illustrations are concerned, and which is the illustration in which it can be said that it was because of compulsion, it was because of the threat that he had done an act, and hence he is not at all made punishable by the provisions of the Indian Penal Code is the question for our consideration. Now, if you start reading this section which says, except murder and offences against the state punishable with death. So now, whatever may be the situation, you cannot kill somebody and commit the offense of murder and say that it was because of the threat. And hence, as far as the first illustration is concerned, when A puts Mr. B and compels him to kill Mr. C, B is not protected, because the law demands that when you are placed in such a situation that it is not possible for you to save your life otherwise than by taking life of somebody else, law demands that you should sacrifice your own life. So as far as the first illustration, this starts with what? It starts with except murder and offences against the state punishable with death. Now this is which are the offences against the state punishable with death, with which we shall be dealing when we start right from section 121 up to 130, which are the offences against the state. So when you are placed in such a situation that you are compelled to commit an act which is an offense against the state punishable with death, naturally you are not at all protected. When your life and the life of the nation is at stake, you are compelled to commit an offense which is against the state punishable with death, you must sacrifice your life for the sake of this nation. That is what is expected. So these are two exceptions. Whatever may be the situation, whichever may be the threat, whichever may be the compulsion, you cannot commit the offense of murder and get a defense as far as section 94 is concerned, and which are those offences except murder and offences against the state punishable with death. With this now, the further part of the story, in order to answer rest of the three illustrations, further part of the story, it says, nothing is an offence which is done by a person who is compelled to do it by threats, which at the time of doing it reasonably cause the apprehension that instant death to that person will otherwise be the consequence. So what is the defense, or what should be the nature of the threat? Fear of instant death is the only defense that can be raised on the part of an individual. Now, in the third illustration, when A is having a stick and he tells Mr. B, you give one blow to Mr. C, otherwise I will beat you with the help of the stick. Here there is a nature of the fear because of which act is done by Mr. B, but the fear is what is known as short of instant death, and because of the fact that it is short of instant death, Mr. B is not at all protected. So there must be a fear of only one thing, and what is that? Fear must be of instant death, as it is made very clear. So in the third illustration, as there is a fear, no doubt about it, but the fear is of short of instant death, Mr. B is not at all protected. B cannot get benefit. His case won't fall under section 94 of the Indian Penal Code is concerned. In the last illustration, fourth illustration, when A tells Mr. B that go and commit theft with respect to the property, pain of Mr. C within a period of 8 days, otherwise I will kill you. Now, and he does the act. There is a fear. Fear is of death, no doubt about it. But what is the nature? It is not fear of instant death, but it is a fear of future death. And hence what we say? Mr. B is not at all protected as far as the last illustration is concerned. But if you remember, second illustration, when A has put Mr. B in fear of instant death, and then he compels him to give one blow with the help of the stick to Mr. C, Mr. B is protected because the fear is that of instant death, that is one thing, and secondly, so the requirement of the fear, what is the nature of the fear, where you can raise a defense, what is known as compulsion or threat as a defense, fear must be that of instant death. So in this illustration there is a fear of instant death, and he has done an act which amounts to an offense, barring murder, except murder and offences against the state punishable with death, and he is compelled to do here an offence. And what is offence? Voluntarily causing hurt or voluntarily causing grievous hurt, as defined maybe either as per section 321 or section 322 of the Indian Penal Code. So this is, if you 1, 2, 3, 4 illustrations are taken into consideration, and if you try to understand, one, there must be a fear of instant death, and the person must be compelled to do an act which is an offense, but that is not an offense of what? Murder or offenses against the state punishable with death. The person is protected as per section 94 of the Indian Penal Code is concerned. But then as you go on reading this section, the further part of the section, which is the proviso, it says, so by this time what you have done? Except murder and offences against the state punishable with death, nothing is an offence which is done by a person who is compelled to do it by threats, which at the time of doing it reasonably cause the apprehension that instant death to that person will otherwise be the consequence. And the further part says, provided that the person doing the act did not of his own accord or from a reasonable apprehension of harm to himself short of instant death, place himself in the situation by which he became subject to such constraint. So now proviso makes it very clear. Proviso says that, and to understand proviso, if you read two explanations. One, first explanation says a person who of his own accord, or by reason of threat of being beaten, so there is no fear of instant death, being beaten, joins a gang of dacoits, knowing their character, is not entitled to the benefit of this exception on the ground of his having been compelled by his associates to do anything that is an offence by law, because he joined of his own accord. In that sense, there was no fear of instant death, and hence such a person cannot get, and if he is compelled to do an act, So he is not protected as far as section 94 of the Indian Penal Code is concerned. Or the second explanation says, a person seized by a gang of dacoits and forced by threat of instant death to do a thing which is an offense by law. For example, a smith compelled to take his tools and to force the door of a house for the dacoit entitled to the benefit of this exception. But if they have put him in fear of instant death and compelled him to open the lock for where they wanted to commit the offense, now here he has joined this because of the fear of instant death, and as he has not committed any one of the offences, namely except murder and offences against the state punishable with death, he is protected as far as section 94 is concerned. Now the person doing the act did not of his own accord, as it is in first explanation. He joins a gang of dacoit of his own from a reasonable apprehension, and when there is from a reasonable apprehension of harm to himself short of instant death. So if it is of instant death, he is protected, otherwise not. Place himself in the situation by which he became subject to such constraint. So that is as per section 94, which deals with what do you mean by compulsion or threat as a defense is concerned. In 4 illustrations, if the defense is raised by Mr. B that I was compelled, because of the compulsion I have done the act, it is done against my will, hence it can be said that it is done against my will, there was no criminal intention and I am not liable. As per the law, namely section 94, which deals with general exception, he can get protection only as far as second situation is concerned, because when there is a fear of instant death, you can have this defense, compulsion or threat can be a defense, but then in the rest of when it is a fear of death, when it is a fear short of death, or whether it is a fear of future death, in that case Mr. Person is not at all protected as far as section 94 of the Indian Penal Code is concerned. So this is, as we have started discussing, section 90, section 9. First of all, we dealt with section 81, and now this is section 94 of the Indian Penal Code, which deals with what do you mean by compulsion or threat as a defense. Now there are 2 more sections as far as absence of criminal intention is concerned, and those sections are section 92 and section 93, but these are the sections with which we will continue our discussion as far as next part is concerned.